Hi, everyone, and welcome to Ovum's webinar on Mobile World Congress 2019 Operator Strategies. I am Mike Roberts, a research director at Ovum. I will be your moderator today. I will also be introducing our other speakers shortly. But welcome again. We will have time for questions at the end. You can submit your questions on the interface, type in your questions, and we'll get to as many of those as we can at the end. So who is Ovum? For those of you who don't know us, we essentially are a research and consulting business to help any kind of service provider, including digital service providers and their technology partners, thrive in the connected digital economy. We serve 18 of the 20 largest CSPs, provide over 100 5-year forecasts, and we have near 150 analysts providing perspective on the TMT industry globally. So who are you going to hear from today? I introduced myself, Mike Roberts, the moderator. I'm a research director at Ovum. We're going to then go on to Dario Talmazio. He's going to talk about service providers and their 5G plans. And then I will introduce Eden Zoller, who's going to cover consumer AI. And then I will hand over to George Gigi Ashvili, who will look at gaming, augmented reality, and virtual reality at the show. So I've got a few slides to start with, which I'll run through now. Just a selection of some of the operator highlights that I noticed at the show. And then all the others will dive deeper into this theme. It was interesting to me that 5G was obviously huge. Maybe not a lot of headlines around operator 5G launches, but one that we did notice, and you probably noticed as well, was Sprint in the U.S. Announcing a major launch of its 5G service planned in May. And we also noticed a sort of a data-only player in South Africa announcing that it had launched. You could interpret that as may shortly launch a 5G commercial network in South Africa. And we just wanted to contextualize this with a little bit of our data showing, South Africa will have a fairly low 5G penetration through 2023, but of course that will take the top end of the market, whereas in the U.S. you kind of got the other end of the spectrum, and you'll have close to 180 million 5G subscribers by 2023, representing close to half of total mobile subscriptions in that market. Another interesting development we noticed, IoT, of course, there was a lot going on. It was interesting that AT&T and Vodafone announced a partnership for automotive IoT, a huge segment of the IoT market, as many of you would know. And this partnership covers North America, Europe, and Africa, and a number of segments in automotive IoT, and essentially they're going to come together to try and simplify the deployment process, which, as you would know, can be very complicated with something as complicated as a car and all the systems involved. And again, just highlighting some of the work and research and consulting we provide on this segment. We see that the number of connected cars in the U.S. will double from 2018 to 2022. Currently, if we look at both the U.S. and Europe, we already have close to 100 million connected cars in market. And when you take Europe and North America by the end of 2023, that will be closer to 175 million. And the colored bars you see there relate to the share of connected cars by region in the chart that you see there. I also wanted to touch on another development because, we're going to talk a lot about 5G, about artificial intelligence, excuse me, AR and VR. but I didn't want to overlook, a large part of the mobile market that is still relying on some very strong technologies for providing connectivity. And just picking one of the announcements, we had Orange launched a low-cost 3G smartphone called Sanza, and you see a picture of it there. The phone is going to include Google Assistant. It's going to be priced at $20, which is obviously a pretty competitive price, and will be launched in 16 countries in Africa and the Middle East. And although many of you would know this, I just wanted to highlight that at the same time we're talking about 5G and artificial intelligence and AR, VR, and other cutting-edge areas, we can't forget that the majority of the market, of the mobile market in some regions, is still very much a 2G and 3G market. Ovum's data on the mobile market shows that 2G is actually still the top technology in Africa in terms of penetration. It has 53% of subscriptions this year versus 3G at 42% and 4G much lower, and 5G, of course, just beginning as per our coverage of the previous announcement on 5G. So really you think, oh gosh, isn't this back to the future? But on the other hand, it makes huge sense to launch based on technologies that are still the dominant technologies in market in some regions, as 3G is in Africa. And I also just wanted to touch on a similar theme. Again, my colleagues are going to touch on some of the the real cutting edge stuff happening at Mobile World Congress, but I didn't want to overlook that in a world that has about 8 billion people, not quite that many, but if we round up, there's about a population of 8 billion worldwide. And again, if I round, rather than being exactly to the number, roughly half of that global population does not have access to the internet. Now, of course, you need access to all sorts of things in a lot of the regions we're talking about, perhaps before you need access to the internet. But as we all know, the importance of the internet only increases, and if you don't have access to it, you are clearly at a disadvantage in some ways. So I just picked out one of the announcements in Mobile World Congress on this area. Facebook partnering with telco players to essentially use Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi hotspots initially. Facebook's Express Wi-Fi initiative is making it easier for entrepreneurs and small businesses in developing markets to launch a Wi-Fi hotspot service to provide low-cost access to the internet while also providing an opportunity for entrepreneurship. And you can see some of the operators that signed on to this included Celsi in South Africa, Vodafone in Ghana, and Globe in the Philippines, and a number of technology partners coming on board that you see listed there. And I would say that this is one example. Facebook just on its own is doing things ranging from free basics, which provides free access to the internet in a very basic way on phones. There's been some ups and downs with that initiative, to many other companies that are working to solve this problem and basically to bring connectivity to a larger percentage of the global population, which actually Ovum feels could transform the internet in some ways, albeit gradually, since it's a very substantial challenge to solve, bringing the internet access to people at really costs that have not been possible or achievable before. So this is an area certainly to keep an eye on while we continue to look at the more cutting edge areas that my colleagues will be covering. So with that, I would like to go ahead and hand over to my colleague, Dario Talmasio. He's a principal analyst and practice leader at Ovum, and he's going to be talking about service providers and their 5G and other plans announced at Mobile World Congress. So Dario, over to you.
Thank you, Mike. Good morning, evening, or afternoon, everybody. I would just want to start with a recap on what's happening in 5G terms. Maybe before I go into the content of the slides, a couple of observations with regard to 5G at Mobile World Congress 19. The most important one is an overarching sense of optimism from service providers. I think for those of you who have followed last year's event or the previous year's event, there was some skepticism, there was some sense of disillusion about what 5G could bring. I think this year is a year where it becomes a bit more real. Actually, for sure, it becomes real. Probably the crowd was not enthusiastic about 5G, not the same way it made an impression. New networks used to make an impression, but I think it's a combination of the fact that the crowd is not easily impressed with even the most important and mind-blowing things these days. Surely an industry that is upbeat, probably because one of the reasons was because Barcelona was very nice, warm and sunny. Everybody tend to be in a good mood compared to the previous year when it was wet and cold. The question we still have is whether this optimism is going to translate into more capex for 5G. As we all know, Mobile World Congress coincides with operators updating their capex outlook. We are still putting together the picture of what is going to be like for 5G. Is it more capex or less capex or equal capex than previous years? And we will be providing the answer to this research question that we have for ourselves as well. So for those of you who engage with Ovum on a regular basis, the question will be coming soon. The other important aspect of 5G, I think, from this year is obviously the fact that a number of devices have been demoed or announced at Mobile World Congress. I've listed a few names, but if you look at the picture on the top right, it's also interesting to see that most of these devices were kept in cases, glass boxes, and not always we were allowed to play with it, which is an indication that maybe some fine-tuning still needs to happen, either on the device side or the network side. What is interesting from the consumer side of 5G, we've been talking about business cases for quite some time. If you remember, last year was all about video. This year is all about gaming, as per the picture on the top left. We'll be talking about gaming more later on, and I don't want to take too much of that time right now, but it seems to be identified as one of the potential so-called killer apps of 5G. The other two aspects of 5G is FWA. FWA, as expected, is not mainstream news as it used to be, simply because there's something else to talk about this year, which simply wasn't there in the previous year. So FWA remains important. We've seen some really interesting and compelling CPEs being announced. However, in terms of news worth it, is not as exciting as the smartphone or AI-powered use cases. I think the other interesting aspect of 5G this year was not just that OEMs have launched their branded devices, but also we have seen an operator, Orange, introducing their own branded 5G device, which is unusual for a new technology to come operator branded so quickly. This is the picture on the bottom left, but it's clearly indicative of the fact that the operator is intending to work harder on the device side of the market and bring it to those price points that are needed for their market. I'm thinking specifically of developing markets. In terms of consensus around which dates and which years 5G is going to be launched, I think we are still sticking to our forecast, which we published several iterations of in regard to 5G. The big year of commercial momentum for 5G is going to be next year, which is around the corner now. However, we are going to see many devices being introduced this year and many operators switching on their networks this year. I think the most interesting aspect for me in 5G terms this year is the Xiaomi devices at a price point that is incredibly good. We're talking about 600 euros for a 5G device for the European market. That is definitely changing the dynamics as we knew it. As in the previous iteration of mobile technology, we were expecting 5G devices to come at a really high price point and go down very slowly. This is no longer the case for 5G. Also, no longer the case for 5G is the fact that there are some geographies coming in and some geographies being late. In 5G, probably it's the first time the market is coming in all together. So it's not just Asia, it's not just US, it's not just Northern Europe. It's a bit of all of it together. Let's move on to the B2B cases. B2B cases have been for many years named as the drivers for 5G. Still correct. I think an observation is Industry 4.0 in terms of at least announcement has completely replaced the stage of the car industry that used to be always a top line keynote talk. Industry 4.0 is by far the most talked about business case when we're talking about 5G. Obviously, network slicing that goes with it. Very many demos of 5G standalone based network slicing and private networks. Private networks is probably one of the most talked about use cases for 5G in the B2B market. But I think what is really new this year in monetization terms is that everybody is aware that the killer app doesn't exist, and probably ecosystem management capabilities are the new killer app for 5G. I'm using a quote from many delegates. The most exciting 5G use case still haven't been imagined, which is true. Nonetheless, service providers are clear about the fact that if they build their networks and the platforms that are able to support partners will eventually facilitate the introduction of 5G. A lot of discussion about open APIs, a lot of discussion about architectures that are fast enough for operators to facilitate the introduction of services from web scale operator or online digital players. As Mike mentioned at the start, this is another topic that is quite important. Of course, it's Mobile World Congress. We would expect it to be all about spectrum and licensed spectrum. In reality, the unlicensed spectrum initiatives are still going very strong. I'm bringing here 3 examples. One is from Deutsche Telekom using 26 gigahertz unlicensed spectrum to introduce FWA service, so fixed line connectivity. I will not talk about Express Wi-Fi by Facebook because it was introduced by Mike earlier on. I would like just to talk about Orange Business Services sharing with us some of their experience with LoRa, which is, as you know, an unlicensed LPWA technology. It still is going strong. So yes, Mobile World Congress is about operators and their spectrum, but not just unlicensed. And within that, FMC, as in a combination of mobile and fixed-based connectivity, are going strong too. Overarching theme of Mobile World Congress of every year is obviously the operators' willingness and capabilities to be more agile and become more of a web player rather than a traditional telco operator. I've got two examples here from operators. Very interesting discussion with Singtel CEO of Consumer about how they introduced essentially omni-channel architecture into their network, but also a number of digital transformation-based capabilities that help them service their customer better. Open access from Telefonica will be talked about a bit more in tomorrow's webinar. And just before Mobile World Congress, something really interesting is the fact that two historical rivals in the automotive industries have joined forces to launch their mobility service. And with that, I think I will pass it on to my colleague. Yes,
so
please.
Dario, this is Mike, the moderator. I'm going to ask one quick question. I found that very interesting. Thank you. You can leave it on the previous slide for Eden. So what was in and what was out with 5G at Mobile World Congress quickly? Was anything less prevalent than before or anything, more so than before?
Okay, what's in, what's out? I think in optimism, out pessimistic view. In first time right rather than first time at all costs. In Industry 4.0 rather than automotive. In smartphone rather than FWA CPEs. In cloud gaming instead of video. In ecosystem management instead of killer apps. If I have to summarize it in 30 seconds.
So that was great, Dario. There's a lot that's in 5G, which is fantastic. So thank you very much, Dario. We are going to leave it there. And I'm going to hand over now to Eden Zoller, who's a principal analyst at Ovum. And Eden is going to be talking about consumer artificial intelligence. So Eden, over to you.
Cheers, Mike, and hello, everybody. Yeah, I'm going to be focusing on AI in the consumer domain and from an operator perspective. I think it's fair to say that AI-powered assistants have become a staple feature of Mobile World Congress, but there weren't any big launches this year. That said, there were some interesting moves from operators, including Orange and Telefonica, and you can see some of their stats on the screen, including some pretty punchy objectives for Aura in 2019. Now, operators are working hard to build service ecosystems for their AI assistants, and at the show, Telefonica showed off its living apps ecosystem for Aura that's being powered by Microsoft Azure. Orange has released a 3-tiered integration framework for Jingo that includes open APIs and a co-design option for specialist partners. Operators are also trying to make their assistants smarter. Orange announced a new collaboration with NTT, which will include AI tech that can be used to further enhance Jingo. Telefonica has extended its existing partnership with Microsoft, and we expect this to see Aura leverage Microsoft's cognitive services abilities more deeply. MWC also saw operators trying to move their AI assistants beyond the smart home. Orange, for example, launched a Jingo button that fits on a car's steering wheel and can be used to activate Jingo on smartphones in the vehicle. Now, going forward, Orange wants to explore how Jingo can control functions for the home from the car and vice versa. And Orange would eventually like to see Jingo embedded in vehicle entertainment systems. Meanwhile, South Korea's KT is planning to push a customized version of its Giga Genie assistant more deeply into the hospitality sector, where it's already gained some customers. The Giga Genie hotel platform can be used to control a hotel's entertainment system, lights, heating, and so on, all using interactive voice. Now, monetizing AI assistants is an ongoing challenger for operators, but Telefonica shared some details of how it's been experimenting with monetization with Aura in Argentina. And in that market, Aura has been used to provide recommendations for upselling telco services and devices, and it tends to be the more basic telco services, the core ones. But this year, it's going to sort of extend that recommended and upselling process to TV services. Another interesting development for Aura on the sort of monetization front is plans to launch a sort of a lightweight version of Aura for Telefónica's Blau brand in Germany. And this is interesting because it could be a sort of a precursor for a sort of a white label B2B version of Aura. AI-powered robots were pretty prevalent at MWC, including a clutch of humanoid robots, and you can see a couple of them there. The rather creepy Sophia, and she's up on the sort of right-hand corner, can apparently display 50 different facial expressions, although she was looking slightly pained at the show. It might be because of that rather strange outfit she's wearing. There's the slightly cuter Liku, who's actually being positioned as a sort of a home companion. And the image at the bottom is Kathy, and I thought she was quite interesting. She's basically a service robot with intelligence stored in the cloud and connected to its body via 5G. Now, all these robots are very early stage, and you're not going to be served in a restaurant by one anytime soon. AI assistants of all kinds still have a lot of work to do, and the iterations in smart home speakers are really still leaving a lot of people cold, and you can see that from our survey findings shown on the screen. Now, a clear message from these survey findings is that consumers are frustrated by the digital assistant user experience, and many of these failings relate to the underlying AI capabilities, particularly with a voice interface. Another thing that jumps out from those survey findings is a lot of people simply don't find their digital assistants, their AI assistants useful. And I think this really hammers home the fact that, you know, cool AI tech only gets service providers so far. AI services need to work harder if they're to remain relevant and regularly used by consumers. There was a strong focus on IoT and enterprise and industry verticals, but MWC did show progress for consumer IoT, and there's no doubt that consumer IoT devices and platforms are proliferating, as you can see from these Ovum forecasts. MWC saw Telefónica move further into consumer IoT with the announcement of a suite of My Tracker services, which basically allows people to track and monitor things they care about. And operators continue to push into the connected car domain. Mike mentioned the AT&T and Vodafone alliance at the start, and we touched on how Orange is looking to sort of integrate Django more deeply into the connected car domain. And Telefónica is also looking at a range of additional in-vehicle services such as driver assistance, mobility services, and eventually location-based marketing. Now, 5G drone demos were everywhere at MWC, with a strong showing from operators, Turkcell, China Telecom, SK Telecom, KT and Ooredoo, among others. And the image you can see at the bottom there is a 5G-enabled autonomous helicopter drone from Ooredoo. Now, drones, strictly speaking, are not consumer IoT, but they do impact consumers, and all the operators we talk to are very keen to stress the use of drones for social good, which makes a change. For example, the use of drones in search and rescue missions. Data privacy. Now, this was a reoccurring theme, and the clear message is that AI is changing the data privacy stakes, making it even more challenging. Data privacy in the AI era must have security, transparency, and accountability top of the agenda. Otherwise, consumer trust in data privacy will take another hit. For example, AI will be increasingly used to help process insurance claims. and both insurance firms and consumers need to know why decisions are reached and how. Saying a claim is refused because AI says no is not the way forward. Service providers with poor data privacy credentials will be hit where it hurts, as you can see from these findings from our Over Insight survey. It's fair to say that although most consumers put up with the status quo and don't alter their behaviour, a significant number are starting to become less tolerant, and as a result of changing how they interact with services, as you can see here, using them less or not at all. The flip side is that strong data privacy will be a point of value and differentiation. Trust is collateral. And that wraps up my section of the webinar.
Eden, thank you very much for that. Interesting stuff, as in Dario's. So, quick question. AI assistance, obviously a big theme at MWC. What do you see is coming next for AI assistance, whether it be the user interface or functionality or other? What's your view on that?
Yeah, sure. I'll start with functionality. I mean, today most AI assistants, they actually don't do anything that's sort of overly smart. It's often informational. I think what we will see is the predictive capabilities of AI assistants become a lot sharper and better, to the point where they can actually become more prescriptive. So it's not just about surfacing a recommendation, but sort of kind of providing the next best action, what somebody should do because of a certain situation. And sort of Amazon hunches is sort of like an indication of how this is going. On the user or interface side, I think one thing that's interesting, and you're seeing this in sort of AI assistants embedded in smart home speakers, is visual AI. A lot of these speakers, they have screens or they can interact with screens, and this should enable new forms of engagement for AI speakers. So I think these are two of the key developments we're going to see going forward.
That's great, Eden. Thanks very much for that and for the presentation. So I'm now going to move on to our next presenter. We're going to hear from George G.G. Ashvili. He's going to be looking at AR, VR, and gaming at Mobile World Congress. So George, over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Mike. Hi, everyone. So I will be covering kind of everything around kind of the highlights about gaming, AR, and VR from MWC. So this is my 6th year at the show, and I can tell you that this year was the biggest when it comes to these categories. And then I just wanted to kind of show you, tell you about the highlights that I saw at the show, and I'll try to put them in the perspective of the operators and what they're doing in the space. As Dario touched on this earlier, when it comes to the 5G, 5G has been kind of the catalyst in really promoting gaming content in the space. And it was at the show itself, it was really difficult to avoid gaming, AR, and VR when it comes to operators and other big tech companies. So without further ado, I just wanted to kind of showcase, tell you about some of the highlights from the show. As I said, 5G has kind of spurred on a lot of developments in the space. One of the most impressive ones at the show was on Orange stand. So they had this concept of a virtual meeting using augmented reality. So as you can see on the left, that's me wearing the Magic Leap augmented reality headset. And I could, so sitting down on that desk, I could see a virtual version of the lady sitting in a completely different cubicle. So she appeared in front of me, and also she conjured up a virtual versions of Orange products, including the Jingo smart speaker. I was able to kind of hold the virtual version of that speaker, kind of play around with it whilst the Orange representative told me all about it. So I thought that was really interesting. Other demos included Telefonica's stand about esports. So really, what they showcased there was the low latency that is provided by 5G and how that can boost the esports and kind of broader gaming ecosystem. The OnePlus device, again, which Dario earlier mentioned, they used the 5G to showcase cloud gaming. I will talk about cloud gaming a couple of slides later more in detail. Niantic, which is at the bottom, you can see Niantic are the companies behind the immensely popular Pokemon Go augmented reality smartphone game. So they actually partnered with T-Mobile and they showcased the latest multiplayer game, which essentially it was massive, kind of like a multiplayer, like a laser tag game in augmented reality where multiple users could shoot each other, could run around the physical room and shoot each other with lasers. And again, this was all kind of utilizing 5G. And that was just one of many examples of partnerships that's happening within kind of the operator space and kind of gaming companies teaming up together. Ericsson, again, showcased some of the applications around VR and gaming. LG went very big on VR content streaming at their booth as well. And interestingly, HTC also announced a 5G MiFi, which is capable of streaming VR content. Some of the other key developments in this space where Vodafone partnered with a cloud gaming company, Spanish cloud gaming company called PlayGiga, that included a VR kind of showcase on that. Bottom left, you can see the latest Sony Xperia smartphone. And then the reason why I point this one out is a really interesting thing is happening within kind of the mobile space is that gaming is having a profound effect on the design of smartphones. So, Sony, Samsung, LG, Huawei, most of their new devices have got some sort of a gaming enhancements to it. So be it, for example, a screen that's optimized for gaming or a special cooling system to keep the games operational and so on. So it's really interesting where actually the gaming is having a really big effect on the design of smartphones, and that's really coming through. Some of the other interesting developments in this space where Amdocs is going big on gaming because of their recent acquisitions in content. They're actually they've developed a thing called Game On platform, essentially a white label service which they want to push to operators for the operators who want to provide some sort of a cloud gaming or gaming service. They can use this service to deliver that. Deutsche Telekom and SK Telecom teamed up to deliver a social VR concept. And essentially what that is at MWC, the visitors to the Deutsche Telekom stand could virtually hang out with visitors to the SK Telecom stand in a virtual hangout room where everybody could kind of socialize and watch a football game on a massive screen in that room. So again, this is just a concept, but again, it's just another way that the companies are thinking of, making VR less a solitary experience and more social experience. Google had an interesting kind of augmented reality showcase. Well, as you know, Google always has a big presence at the show. What they did was they had like an augmented reality treasure hunt around MWC where you download the app and the app would essentially, through augmented reality, lead you to Android partner companies like Samsung and others to collect virtual PIN badges and just making the day a bit more fun. And also, there's a lot of movement happening from the cloud companies. So Intel they partnered with Tencent on their upcoming cloud gaming service, Tencent Instant Play, and also Huawei is going really big on their cloud services. As I kind of mentioned earlier, the cloud gaming is really a big story here, and as Dario also pointed out, the cloud gaming is very much in at the moment. And as I call it, the renaissance of cloud gaming is happening right now. So we've had, beginning of the decade, we had a big kind of spike of interest in cloud gaming, but it fizzled out, mainly because it was way ahead of its time because the bandwidth, the latencies wasn't there, the cloud technology wasn't as developed as it is today. So I think the whole industry is kind of having another go at it. And as you can see, operators are very much in the heart of this. So operators are signing partnerships with both technology companies who are involved in cloud gaming and also the content providers in this space. And I just wanted to use this slide just to kind of show you, some of the leading players in this space. And I think, this will kind of continue to grow. For those of you who are not too familiar with cloud gaming, in very short explanation of it is that essentially it allows end users, consumers, to have instant Netflix-like access to huge amounts of games which are not even physically possible to run on smartphones because of hardware requirements, but essentially because all the processing is done in the cloud, it enables you to have really high quality video game experiences delivered to users on literally any device capable of having a good connection. And again, this is where kind of 5G is really coming in and playing a big part. And finally, I just wanted to kind of highlight why there's been so much kind of excitement around gaming recently, and why that is happening. As you can see, this is from our video game revenue forecast, split out by different categories, and traditional video game revenue will grow quite modestly, but if you just compare it to that blue line at the top, as you can see, the growth is quite astonishing. So what we're seeing now is the game developers are very much keen to work with operators. First time in many years where the game developers would largely ignore operators. Now they realize that there's actually a mutually beneficial situation happening now where video game developers can reach out to a broader audience, and likewise operators can raise loyalty to their services, and also operators can appeal to a younger demographic. Looking forward into the future, I think AR and VR will create opportunities for telcos, but even though the adoption for these are quite low, these technologies are rapidly improving. So we think they will eventually create opportunities. And then yes, the three key things in this space for telcos in terms of strategies are offering gaming-focused smartphones, sponsoring esports events, and partnerships around cloud gaming, all of which is already happening, and I think we will see more of it going into the future. Thanks, Mike.
George, that's fantastic. Thanks very, very much for that. So quick question for you, and I did want to remind the audience that we're going to be moving into Q&A after this. Feel free to send in a question writing in the Q&A box, and we'll take as many of those as we can. So George, a trade show that's it's always been mobile at its heart, and as far as mobile augmented reality, there didn't seem to be a lot going on in the application area. What's your take on that?
That's a good question. One thing I would say, yes, definitely. I think when it comes to augmented reality, and the augmented reality headsets and hardware really stole the show. So, be it the Microsoft HoloLens 2 announcement or many other AR smart glasses on the show floor. However, I think nevertheless there are some interesting things happening. For example, probably the biggest one being that Google's investment in this space. So as you know, Google has invested a lot in their AR Core app development platform, and it is growing. And then it really showed off its capabilities on the show floor at MWC. What Google did, they essentially mapped out all 8 halls of the MWC, and then users were able to kind of easily navigate around the venue with augmented reality. So what that can be used for is things like, think of Olympics, helping every single attendee find their way around the massive Olympic park and make sure that they don't get lost and so on. So I think basically, as I mentioned earlier, these technologies are improving rapidly, and I think we will see kind of large-scale developments of it going forward.
Great, George.
Thanks,
That's
Mike.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. So we have finished with the presentation part of the webinar. We now have almost 15 minutes for your questions. We've already had some come in. Keep sending them if you like. I'm going to take one quickly. There's been a number of questions on our 5G forecast. Thank you for the interest. One of the questions was saying they sounded quite rosy, and they're 5 years out. The forecast period is just standard for us 5 years out, but on them sounding rosy, I could provide a little bit of context to say that at the end of this year, our forecast is 721,000 mobile 5G subscriptions worldwide, which barely registers on the mobile market. By the end of next year, 2020, 5G will represent less than 1% of total mobile subscriptions globally. And even when it goes north of 1 billion 5G subscriptions by the end of 2023, that is still only 15% of the rather large global mobile market. So appreciate the question and just wanted to put that into context. So that is trying to answer a number of the questions around our 5G forecast. I'd like to pick one up here. This is coming from Vodafone, and I apologize I didn't name the person who asked before. It was a number of questions compressed together. I'll aim this one at you, Dario. Do you hear operators in Europe deploying 4G on 700 megahertz and then migrating to 5G as device penetration matures? Or will they start with 5G in our deployment in 700 megahertz? Dario, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. I think it's a good intro into our forecast of 5G. In terms of which frequency band, the 700 megahertz band for Europe has been always designated as one of the pioneer bands by vendors, by operators, and sometimes often by regulators too. Nonetheless, licenses tend to be awarded on a technology neutral basis these days, so operators can decide which frequency bands they want. Specifically on the 700 in Europe, we know some operators have already deployed LTE in that band. The one top of my mind I can remember, I think I'm correct, is free in France. Now going ahead, what's going to happen? I think there will be country by country differences in terms of which band, which technology is going to be deployed in 700. But clearly there is a need of having a macro network. The other two bands for Europe is the mid band 3.4 and 3.8, which provides some coverage, but is clearly not as wide as 700. So it will be a mixture of the two, but we believe that eventually for operators that have a 4G business that is quite deployed and B, not a lot of traffic in the 700, there would be a case of starting off 700 with 5G. As I said before, unfortunately, this is one of those cases where you need to look at market by market and consider a number of not even market based, but individually to the operator, essentially where the traffic sits at the moment, to understand whether.
So Dario, thanks very much for that, Dario. Sorry to cut you off. I'm going to try and get a few more questions in the time we have left, but thanks very much for that. So Eden, I have a question here about GDPR. As in, does it go far enough to address consumer concerns around data privacy, particularly in the era of artificial intelligence? What's your take on that one?
Yeah, sure. I'll start off with the sort of, GDPR and the AI era point first. I mean, I think, okay, the difficulty is AI is going to use data for a lot of new and often unforeseen purposes beyond the original scope. And this kind of scenario is at odds with GDPR stipulations that data should be used for specified and explicit purposes and not in ways that someone shouldn't expect. So I think there's these elements that GDPR just doesn't cover, and the framework will need to evolve. But I think in general, GDPR really should be viewed as the starting point, not the end goal of data privacy. And there's a lot of stuff about GDPR I really don't like. The main one being that it puts the burden on the consumer. And I think there's a really strong role for operators to carve out a position as the sort of data privacy champion by really sort of bringing accountability and transparency to the forefront. As I mentioned in my session of the webinar, trust really is collateral.
Eden, that's fantastic. Thank you for that. So George, I see one here that's kind of up your street. Do you have a view on how operators plan to monetize on gaming in AR, VR use cases? What's your take on that?
Thanks, Mike. Yep. So one of the ways, which I think is going to be the predominant one going forward, is use of in-game advertising. So with the success of free-to-play games, including Fortnite, I think we will see more and more examples of in-game advertising. So this could be literally billboards around the venue where you're walking around and seeing, and then these billboards can be and are dynamic. So they will be tailored to each user, depending on things like their preferences, which ads, and then basically to bring it too close to AR and VR, you have even more data points. You can actually see what the headset wearer is actually looking at. So then you can actually find out, how long, which adverts were most relevant to each user, how much time to spend on looking at it. So short answer, I think it's going to be in-game advertising through free content, essentially, but advertising within the games itself. Thank you.
Interesting. Great. Thank you for that, George. So Dario, another one for you, or really anyone can chip in as well. But we had a question about 5G use cases. Did you see any interesting new use cases emerging, particularly in the B2B area at Mobile World Congress?
Thank you, Mike. Yeah, so this is probably a question with a two-part answer. I'm sorry, I will take a bit of time. So in terms of B2B, we, as I said during my presentation, the industry 4.0 specifically providing campus connectivity and specifically providing connectivity for unmanned vehicles in factory floors is probably one of the largest, receives some of the largest coverage at Mobile World Congress. And I know we also have, related to this topic, a question about private networks, whether there are 5G or 4G. Private network is eventually the largest driver of 5G, at least in the initial stages of deployment. Of course, robotics, of course, the automotive industry, and so on and so forth are important. But the private network connectivity seems to be one of the first use cases to become real, simply because they already exist in the 4G environment. Now, the relationship between the B2C, so the consumer 5G, and the B2B, the enterprise 5G, becomes really important here. Often when we talk about private networks, we are actually really talking about a portion or a slice of the macro network that is privately dedicated to an enterprise. And in that is really important that the industry moves on the consumer 5G story, so that the networks are dense enough and wide enough to reach those B2B customers who want to receive a slice of this micro network. The alternative of which would be to deploy base stations that are entirely dedicated to B2B customers. I think, I hope I answered the question. If not, I'll be pretty happy to take it more, take the question offline and go ahead with it.
That's great, Dario. Thank you very much. So I'd like to take another question and direct this to Eden. We have a question about artificial intelligence and robots and 5G. What is the actual connection that we're looking at here once you get beyond hype? Eden, do you have a view on that?
Yeah, sure. That is that's a difficult question. But okay, first of all, I think 5G's as an enabler for robotics is viable. I mean, it's still very early stage, but 5G has the kind of speed and low latency to control robots in real time or pretty close to it, or to make that more specific. So with 5G you can send data to robots, receive it back, enable them to process it in ways that you can't with 4G. So I think in that sort of enabling role, 5G can be really important for robotics. The other element that was mentioned, which is the sort of other sort of AI angle, I guess I'm thinking there more of how that relates to humanoid robots, and those are the ones I sort of highlighted in a couple of images. And on that side of it, there's still a hell of a lot of work to be done. And that comes down to the need for improvements in sort of humanoid robots' cognitive abilities, in their sort of speech capabilities. I mentioned with that Sophia robot that she's allegedly able to sort of recognize and express 50 different emotions, but really no, she couldn't. So there's two elements. Yes, 5G is a great enabler for robotics, I believe. But when it comes to impacts on humanoid robots, it's not just 5G. There's other elements of AI that really do need to improve. And all of this, particularly on the sort of the consumer-facing side, is still some way down the line. So I hope that helps.
That's great, Eden. Thanks very much for that. We've probably got time for one more. I would like to say we've had a number of questions about the slides that you could download being different from what we presented. When the webinar finishes and becomes archived, then the updated versions of the slides will be there available for you to download. So if you could do that then. I'm going to ask one more to George, and that will probably be all we have time for. George, most significant smartphone announcement you noticed at the show? I know at the show or around the show, let's say, because I know sometimes things don't always happen at Mobile World Congress these days. Any quick take on that?
Only thing I would say there that, I mean, this year, as I mentioned earlier, this was my 6th year at the show, and this is the first time when smartphones were exciting again. That's for sure. With the new 5G phones, in addition to the flexible phones, I think there was a real buzz and excitement about smartphones again, which was, I think, a nice change from the doom and gloom stories about smartphones in the years before. I'm not going to say too much because tomorrow we have a separate webinar which will address mobile announcements. So that's all I would say. Please sign up to that, and you can listen all about devices there. Thank you.
George, thanks very much. So that's a perfect intro for our webinar tomorrow at 5 p.m. GMT. This will cover the technologies and devices announced at Mobile World Congress and our analysts' view on that. Feel free to register for that. But for our webinar today, we have come to the end of our time slot. If we did not get to your question, we will answer that via email. You can also, once the webinar is finished, you can go to download the slides we presented, refresh your screen first. And I would just like to thank you all for attending. Thank you very much for your interest in Ovum, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you. Goodbye.